He had everything the streets said you could ever want. Money that moved quietly, respect that traveled faster than his name, and a reputation that made doors open without a knock. In Liverpool's shadow economy, he wasn't just known, he was calculated. People whispered about how high his influence reached, how carefully he moved, how untouchable he seemed. And for a long time, that illusion held strong, until one decision, made in confidence and greed, placed him directly in the sights of people who did not forget, or negotiate.
Long before his name ever carried weight in Liverpool's criminal circles, his beginnings were quiet, almost forgettable, rooted in the kind of streets where ambition grows fast because opportunity does not. Early on, he learned that survival wasn't about strength, it was about timing, awareness, and knowing who to listen to. Lessons absorbed through observation more than instruction. As the years passed, small risks led to small rewards, and small rewards gradually built into something larger. He surrounded himself with people who understood loyalty as currency and silence as protection, slowly stepping from the edges of the street economy into something far more organized. What separated him from others wasn't recklessness, but patience. He waited, watched, and only acted when outcomes leaned heavily in his favor. By the time law enforcement had begun paying attention to the shape of the network forming beneath the surface, his position was already cemented, hidden behind layers of distance and trusted intermediaries. To the outside world, he blended easily into ordinary success, but among those who operated in the same shadows, he was considered a central figure, not loud, not flashy, but effective. With influence came confidence, and with confidence came temptation. International connections promised bigger profits, faster expansion, and a chance to move beyond the limitations of local operations. Deals were no longer restricted by postcode. Routes crossed borders, communication shifted to encrypted channels, and trust became both the most powerful tool and the greatest liability. It was in this higher tier of risk that he encountered figures tied to global trafficking networks, distant, disciplined, and guided by rules far stricter than those of the local underworld. At first, the relationships were cautious and carefully balanced, built on mutual benefit rather than friendship. Each side believed they understood the limits of the other. But power has a way of distorting perception, and success can quietly nurture the belief that every system has weaknesses waiting to be exploited. The robbery that followed was not impulsive. It was designed with the same calculated mindset that had driven his rise. From his perspective, it was a strategic strike, a way to claim independence from partners who no longer felt necessary. What he misjudged was not the logistics, but the culture he had crossed. In his world, conflict often ended in negotiation or quiet restructuring. In theirs, reputation was not symbolic, it was enforced through absolute response. Almost immediately after the theft, the atmosphere around him shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Responses that once came quickly were delayed or never returned. Allies who had previously been eager to align began to keep distance, suddenly cautious of proximity. Though no direct threats arrived, the silence itself carried meaning. He moved more carefully, altered routines, shifted locations, and relied on the same instincts that had protected him for years. Yet for the first time, those instincts were clouded by the knowledge that the game had escalated beyond familiar rules. What unfolded afterward sent a wave of unease through Liverpool's underworld. It wasn't loud or public, but it traveled fast through whispered warnings and abrupt disappearances. The message was unmistakable. Global networks do not resolve betrayal quietly, and distance offers no immunity. Figures who once admired his boldness now spoke of his miscalculation with caution rather than curiosity. The sense of invincibility that had once surrounded him fractured, replaced with the uncomfortable truth that influence built locally does not always translate against international reach. For those watching from the edges, the lesson was immediate and sobering. The ladder of power does not rise endlessly, and every level carries a different cost. In time, the story of his rise became inseparable from the warning embedded in his downfall. Younger operators who once dreamed of following the same path began reconsidering what success truly meant when measured against consequences they could not control. Within law enforcement, attention intensified, not only around the individuals directly involved, but around the wider infrastructure that allowed such alliances to form in the first place. Investigators traced financial patterns, communication channels, and movement between regions, gradually revealing how deeply international connections had threaded into local networks. Yet even as the system pushed forward, the most profound impact unfolded quietly among those who lived close to the margins. Friends who realized how fragile protection really was. Families who learned too late how far ambition had carried someone they once knew as ordinary. And communities left with the lingering echo of fear mixed with disbelief. His story became more than a tale of crime. It became a reflection of how ambition, when unchecked by limits, can turn calculated confidence into irreversible exposure. In the end, what defined his legacy was not how high he climbed, but the boundary he crossed when he believed his reach exceeded consequence. And in Liverpool's hidden world of shifting alliances and unspoken rules, that lesson settled permanently. Some lines exist not as challenges, but as warnings written into the cost of survival itself.
And once that boundary was crossed, everything that followed unfolded with a momentum that no reputation could slow and no influence could redirect. The robbery did more than shift money or control. It reshapes trust across multiple layers of the network at once. Those who had once stood close now quietly recalculated their positions, aware that proximity to him no longer meant protection, but potential exposure. The underworld operates on shared risk, but it survives on shared belief, and the belief in his untouchability had been quietly shattered. Communication became fragmented. Meetings that once carried confidence now felt strained, measured. Even casual interactions were filtered through caution. Behind the scenes, negotiations moved without him. Partners who once depended on his coordination began searching for alternative paths. Not out of disloyalty, but out of survival. What he had interpreted as strategic independence was now seen by others as dangerous unpredictability. Meanwhile, across borders, the response to the robbery took on a wholly different tempo. There were no emotional reactions, no public displays of outrage, only cold recalibration. Routes adjusted. Intermediaries disappeared. Channels once open went silent. In international networks, silence is not absence, it is preparation. He sensed the change, but struggled to interpret its full meaning because the rules he had mastered locally no longer applied with the same logic. In Liverpool, disputes were often eased through indirect mediation. Internationally, disputes were resolved through absolute outcomes. This mismatch in expectation became the most subtle and most dangerous element of the entire conflict. Outwardly, he maintained control. Life appeared unchanged to those outside his inner circle. But inwardly, movement became constrained by layers of caution. Travel plans altered. Schedules grew uncertain. Trust narrowed to a handful of familiar faces. Even then, certainty never returned. The underworld thrives on routine, but routine becomes a vulnerability when the opponent isn't visible. What followed was a period not of immediate consequence, but of drawn-out tension, the most fatiguing kind of danger. Every delay felt like anticipation. Every quiet day felt borrowed. And in that psychological space, power no longer felt like strength, it felt like exposure. Across Liverpool, people spoke in lowered tones. The story traveled faster than any official confirmation. It moved through encrypted messages, brief street conversations, subtle warnings disguised as casual advice. Don't answer unfamiliar calls. Don't stay in one place too long. Don't assume silence means safety. The robbery had not just triggered an individual threat, it had unsettled a balance that many others depended on without ever acknowledging publicly. Law enforcement observers noticed changes too, though not always clearly at first. Patterns shifted. Movement slowed in one area and increased in another. Financial flows took new routes. The network that once appeared stable began showing signs of quiet reconfiguration. To investigators, this kind of disturbance often speaks louder than violence ever could. It signals stress inside the system, pressure without visible explosion. From the outside, it looked like normal activity. From within, it felt like standing beneath a ceiling that might collapse at any unannounced moment. For him, the longest trial was not immediate consequence, but waiting for confirmation of what instinct already knew had been set in motion. Every unfamiliar face carried uncertainty. Every delay carried meaning. The confidence that once drove his decisions now competed with doubt he had never fully experienced. Not fear exactly, but the heavy awareness that the game had expanded beyond the boundaries he understood. And yet, retreat was no longer possible. The robbery could not be undone. What had been taken could not be quietly returned without admitting weakness, an admission that, in his world, could invite danger as surely as defiance. He stood between two impossibilities: resistance on one side, surrender on the other. The space in between was where the illusion of control finally collapsed. The most unsettling truth was not that retaliation might come, but that its timing could not be predicted. In local disputes, escalation is often immediate. Internationally, delay is a weapon. It allows narrative to spread, examples to deepen, and anticipation to dismantle confidence long before outcomes appear. Weeks passed, then months, and with each passing stretch of quiet, the psychological toll grew heavier. He began to isolate further, not out of secrecy alone, but because even familiar conversations now carried risk, overheard details, misplaced trust. Power once came from connection, now survival demanded isolation. For those once closest to him, the transformation was unmistakable. The man who had once moved with certainty now spoke with restraint. Decisions slowed. Options narrowed. The rise that once felt like ascent now felt like standing at an irreversible edge. The network he had built did not collapse all at once, but pieces quietly detached themselves, drifting towards safer centers of gravity. Loyalty in such environments is rarely tested through words. It is tested through risk. And when risk becomes asymmetrical, loyalty often dissolves without confrontation. What remained strongest were not friendships, but obligations, the cold, transactional links that exist until they are no longer useful. From the outside, his story remained mostly invisible. There were no headlines, no press statements, no public acknowledgement of the unseen collision forming across borders. That invisibility was part of what made the situation so perilous. There was no warning siren, no countdown clock visible to anyone beyond the smallest inner circle. Only probability, tightening with time. And as that probability grew heavier, so did the realization that reputation, no matter how carefully built, offers no shield against systems that operate without emotion. The robbery had briefly made him feel powerful. Its aftermath revealed the opposite, that power without alignment becomes exposure, and visibility without protection becomes vulnerability. In the underworld, the most dangerous moment is not when conflict erupts, but when expectation sets in. And by the end of that waiting period, expectation had settled into everything. The question was no longer if consequence would arrive, but when and in what form. The streets of Liverpool, once familiar and navigable to him, now felt like a map filled with unknown variables. Every route, every stop, every interaction carried a new weight. The sheer scale of what he had set in motion became unmistakable, not because retaliation had occurred, but because it hadn't yet. And in that space of suspended certainty, the robbery revealed its true cost. Not the money taken, not the control challenged, but the irreversible shift from strategic confidence to permanent risk, from a world governed by local rules to one where the boundaries of consequence stretched far beyond anything he could manage alone.
And once that realization settled in, the wider impact rippled outward far beyond his own shrinking circle. News, even when unspoken, has a way of traveling through underground networks with extraordinary speed. Nothing needed to be announced. The shift in atmosphere did all the talking. People who had once chased proximity to his influence now quietly recalibrated their ambitions. Ambition itself didn't disappear, it simply changed direction. Where his name once represented opportunity, it now represented caution. Younger figures who had monitored his rise closely began drawing different conclusions from his story than they once had. They no longer spoke about how fast he climbed, but about the moment he misjudged the scale of the world he had entered.
In the hidden economy of reputation, stories like his function as lessons more powerful than any warning ever could. They are repeated quietly, refined in whispers, and passed on as guidance. Success is not just about what you build, but about who you challenge along the way. Across Liverpool's underworld, alliances tightened and loosened in response. Some groups pulled inward, reinforcing boundaries and minimizing exposure. Others sought new channels, believing that distance from the situation meant safety. Every adjustment, no matter how subtle, was part of the same silent consensus forming beneath the surface, that the rules had shifted and everyone needed to move accordingly. For those operating at the edges, the message was unmistakable. Global power does not play by local rules, and local influence does not grant immunity. Meanwhile, law enforcement attention followed the disturbance like gravity. Large criminal networks rarely fracture without leaving traces, and the changes in behavior, movement, and communication signaled internal pressure. Investigators didn't need a public incident to understand that something significant had taken place. Financial routes altered. Trusted intermediaries vanished from certain roles and appeared in others. Structures once stable began revealing seams. These weren't dramatic changes, but to experienced analysts they were signs of recalibration under stress. A network does not reorganize itself without reason. And though much of the conflict remained invisible to the public, the institutional response was anything but passive. Efforts intensified quietly, focused not on spectacle but on long-term dismantling. Surveillance sharpened, intelligence from multiple regions began to intersect. What had once been treated as separate strands increasingly appeared connected through shared pressures now converging on the same fault line. Yet for all this movement, the broader public remained largely unaware of what was unfolding beneath the surface. On the streets above, daily life continued without obvious interruption. Shops opened, trains ran, nightlife pulsed on weekends. The contrast between the ordinariness of the city and the unseen volatility beneath it only amplified the sense of how layered reality truly was. In one version of Liverpool, people moved through routine. In another, quieter version, balance had been disrupted in a way that would take years to fully settle. Those closest to him lived within that second version. For them, time stretched differently. Every day was measured not in normal milestones, but in uneventful survival. Silence, once interpreted as safety, slowly lost that meaning. Silence became simply delay, and delay, in their world, had never meant forgiveness. As the months wore on, his name began to fade from active conversation, not because it no longer mattered, but because speaking it openly no longer felt necessary. The story had already embedded itself into the shared understanding of what happens when lines that seem negotiable are in truth absolute. His influence, once visible through control and coordination, now lingered only as cautionary gravity. People adjusted paths without needing to say why. That is how lessons truly stick in underground worlds, not as speeches, but as altered behavior. The most profound transformation was not external, but internal. The belief in personal exception, the idea that skill, intelligence, or reputation could bend consequence, lost credibility. In its place grew a colder, more measured outlook. The underworld has never lacked ambition, but it thrives on evolutionary learning, and his story became one of those evolutionary pivots. It shifted how risk was calculated. It shifted how loyalty was interpreted. It reshaped what untouchable truly meant in an era where borders no longer contained accountability. Even for those who never met him, his shadow adjusted their decisions. Deals were approached more cautiously. Connections were vetted more deeply. Independence was no longer framed as freedom alone, but as isolation that could quickly become exposure. Across wider criminal circles beyond Liverpool, the message traveled too, not as a rumor, but as an understood outcome. International networks function partly on narrative control. They maintain authority by ensuring that stories of consequence circulate more effectively than stories of success. And in that system, his robbery and everything that followed became a fixed point of reference, a reminder that power is hierarchical, not merely local. For some, that realization cooled reckless ambition. For others, it sharpened the hunger to climb without crossing the wrong thresholds. In both cases, behavior changed. Meanwhile, the human cost continued quietly. Families were left navigating absence without explanation. Associates adjusted to a future where certainty had evaporated. Communities that had never fully understood who he was now carried fragments of a story they could never fully verify. The public never sees the full shape of these hidden conflicts, only their echoes. What remains are shifts in tone, sudden disappearances, and the quiet rearrangement of influence that tells those who listen that something irreversible has occurred. His legacy, then, was not written in headlines, but in caution. Not in celebration or condemnation, but in the recalibration of risk across a system that survives by adapting. He had risen within Liverpool's underground by mastering its rules. He had fallen from that position by assuming those rules were universal. His story illustrated with relentless clarity that in the layered world of organized crime, visibility is not power, and confidence is not protection. The deepest control is held not by those who move loudly, but by those whose responses are certain and patient. And in that reality, the end of his influence did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded as a gradual withdrawal of certainty from everything he once touched. By the time the lesson fully settled into the collective memory of the underworld, it no longer needed to be spoken. It existed in hesitation. It existed in redirected ambition. It existed in the careful way new players now measured the distance between local success and global consequence. His rise had once symbolized possibility. His end symbolized boundary. And in the long, quiet aftermath, that boundary became one of the most enduring rules of all. Some power can be challenged, and some never should.